Leningrad in the late 1970s existed in a strange stillness, suspended between imperial memory and Soviet control. The winter light fell in pale sheets over the city, and the streets were filled with the echoes of trolleybuses dragging themselves across frozen rails. Inside the cramped Korolev apartment above Nevsky Prospect, life unfolded in a quiet struggle against monotony. The walls were covered with old wallpaper that peeled at the corners, and the tiny kitchen always smelled of boiled potatoes and damp bread. Yet within this modest space lived a family bound by a fierce kind of love. Tatiana worked long hours in a textile factory and returned home each evening with hands cracked from cold water and machinery. Her husband Sergei drove a streetcar and carried the tired gaze of a man who had spent decades obeying orders without question. Their son Mikhail was the light around which their small world revolved. From childhood, he displayed a curiosity that unsettled even the most patient teachers. He questioned everything, especially the things people avoided discussing. Why did the country forbid certain books? Why did foreigners disappear behind closed doors? Why did everyone speak in two voices, one for the state and one whispered in private? It was not rebellion that shaped his questions, but an instinctive hunger for truth. By the time he reached adolescence, he had begun reading samizdat pages that passed from hand to hand like contraband dreams. He devoured banned poems and foreign ideas hidden under floorboards or carried in coat pockets, and each secret line he read opened his mind wider than the state ever intended. When he entered Leningrad State University, the shift became more pronounced. The university had become a quiet battleground of ideas. Professors taught carefully measured lessons, while students exchanged forbidden thoughts under dim lamps in crowded dorm rooms. It was there that Mikhail met Elena, a linguistics student who moved through the world with a quiet fire. She asked questions that mirrored his own, and their conversations flowed far into the night, touching on philosophy, freedom, and the future of a country that seemed determined never to change. For the first time, he began to imagine not only escape, but transformation. He believed that knowledge could reshape nations, and that truth was worth pursuing even when it lived behind locked doors. Tatiana sensed something changing in him long before she understood it. He came home later, and later often returning with eyes clouded by thoughts he refused to share. His voice grew sharper, his silences heavier, and his posture tense as if he were carrying an invisible weight. She tried to tell herself that university life was molding him, but doubt crept into her thoughts like frost across a window pane. Then one evening, while cleaning his room, she discovered the notebook that would alter the course of their lives. It was tucked under his mattress, filled with pages of precise handwriting and detailed diagrams. At first, she thought it was academic work, perhaps notes for a physics course. But as she read, her stomach tightened. These were not harmless thoughts. They were observations of border weaknesses, descriptions of Soviet radar schedules, reflections on Western physics research, and speculations that hinted at forbidden comparisons. Every word felt like a blade held dangerously close to his son's throat. She closed the notebook with trembling hands and sat in the dim light of his room, listening to the hum of the city outside. All her life she had been taught that loyalty meant survival and that secrecy protected the family. She had heard stories whispered in fear about neighbors taken in the night, and she had learned that danger often entered a home through curiosity rather than crime. For 3 nights she lay awake grappling with the weight of what she had seen. She imagined men in heavy coats at their door, imagined interrogations, imagined her son disappearing into a system that did not tolerate questions. Every possible future seemed catastrophic. She felt the walls of their apartment closing in on her, as if the very air had turned hostile. The decision she would make came quietly one morning, as she watched her son stand at the kitchen window staring into the gray sky. He whispered that one day he would touch a sky that belonged to no one. Those words pierced her like a prophecy. Something inside her broke. She believed that if she did not act, she would lose him to forces she could not control. She believed that if she sought help from the authorities, they would guide him back to safety. She believed the state protected loyal families. She was wrong, but she did not yet know it. She folded the notebook shut, tied her scarf around her neck, and walked out into the freezing morning light on a path that felt both inevitable and irreversible. She believed she was saving him. She did not understand that in the Soviet Union, a mother's fear could become the very weapon that destroyed her child. The winter of 1981 pressed itself against the walls of a modest Leningrad apartment where 27-year-old Viktor Mikhail moved with the rigid caution of a man who no longer trusted his own shadow. His mother Galina had begun noticing the change months earlier. The boy who once laughed easily now sealed his bedroom door at night and slept with a coat on as if preparing to run at a moment's notice. Neighbors whispered that Victor worked too closely with foreign dock workers near the Baltic port, that he was too curious about Western ships unloading cargo at odd hours, that he had been seen writing notes in a small black journal he kept hidden under his mattress. Galina pretended not to hear them, but deep down, she felt a creeping dread that her son had stepped onto a path that would bring the state crashing into their lives. Victor spent his evenings listening to foreign radio frequencies, twisting the dial until the static cracked open into faint English broadcasts. He would lean close, absorbing the news of the world beyond the Iron Curtain, and learning pieces of information the Kremlin considered dangerous in the hands of ordinary citizens. One night, Galina stood in the hallway and listened to him scribble something quickly, shutting his notebook the second he sensed movement outside his door. That was the moment she realized something had changed in him, not a passing interest, but a shift toward secrecy. Victor's mood darkened over the following weeks, as if he were carrying knowledge that weighed heavier than he could bear. He avoided long conversations and snapped easily at harmless questions. Galina began to press him carefully, but every answer he gave felt half true, the other half swallowed before it reached his tongue. One evening, she saw him pacing the kitchen, staring at the window, as though expecting a knock from men who never knocked twice. Victor finally whispered something that froze her in place. He said there were things happening in the port, things the state would never admit, things even the workers were afraid to talk about. He had overheard containers being transferred off the record and foreign intermediaries paying bribes to Soviet officers whose names he recognized. He said he had written down details but didn't know what to do with them, and that the secrets were making him sick. Galina wanted to tell him to burn everything, forget everything, but the words wouldn't come. She only nodded, watching the fear behind his eyes harden into something closer to fatal resolve. That night, she searched his room, shaking with guilt and desperation. She found the black notebook under loose floorboards. Inside were pages filled with dates, names, ship registry numbers, and coded references to officers known for their loyalty to Moscow. Victor had uncovered a corruption ring involving high-ranking officials, smuggling operations, and illegal foreign transactions that could compromise state security. If the KGB discovered he had documented it, they would assume espionage, collaboration, treason. As she stood there holding the notebook, Galina felt her world tilt. Her son had crossed an invisible line, and there was no path back. She imagined the knock at the door, the quiet arrest, the neighbors peering through their curtains pretending not to watch. She imagined the interrogation rooms, the sleepless nights, the way the state devoured people for far less. Galina returned the notebook, but she could no longer look at her son without hearing an inner voice repeating the same chilling thought: there is only one way to protect him. Her fear hardened into a single unbearable belief: if she turned him in first, perhaps she could control how they handled his case. Perhaps they would show leniency if the information came from a loyal citizen. Perhaps a mother's loyalty to the state would outweigh the appearance of treason. She convinced herself that informing the KGB was not an act of betrayal, but an act of protection, a twisted logic born from decades of conditioning under a regime where silence was deadly and loyalty was currency. As Victor slept, she sat in the dark kitchen with her hands clasped tightly, whispering apologies he would never hear. By dawn, her decision was made, and the next morning, she put on her warmest coat, stepped into the biting Leningrad wind, and walked toward the local KGB office, carrying her son's fate like a weight she could no longer stand to hold. The KGB building on Litany Prospect rose like a block of frozen stone against the Leningrad morning, its windows reflecting the pale winter light in a way that made the whole structure feel watchful. When Galina approached its doors, her breath clouded in the air, each step sounding heavier than the one before. She had convinced herself during the walk that she was doing the right thing, that loyalty to the state would shield her son from the worst of its punishments. But as soon as she stepped into the lobby, a suffocating silence wrapped around her. The walls were lined with portraits of Soviet leaders staring down with the cold judgment of men who tolerated no hesitation and no betrayal. A uniformed officer behind a small desk looked up slowly, his eyes lingering a second too long on her trembling hands. She gave her name in a tight whisper and said she wished to report something important, something concerning state security. That was enough to get her ushered upstairs without another question. The building swallowed her as she climbed narrow staircases and walked through dim hallways lit by sickly yellow bulbs. When she was finally led into a small interview room, the door closed behind her with a sound that felt like a lock clicking shut on fate itself. Inside, a man in a dark suit sat waiting. His face was smooth, calm, unreadable, someone trained to gather truth by stripping away comfort. He introduced himself simply as Officer Chernov, then gestured for her to sit. His voice carried no warmth, only precision. At first, Galina could barely speak. Her throat tightened, her palms dampened, and she felt as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Chernov waited patiently in the way interrogators do when they already know they will get what they came for. When she finally managed to talk, her words tumbled out in fragments. She spoke about Victor's strange behavior, about the radio broadcasts, about the notebook she had found. She avoided speaking his name at first, but Chernov asked it calmly, and she gave it as if confessing a sin. Chernov asked for every detail: dates, people, what exactly Victor had written, where he hid the notebook, whether he had contact with foreigners. His questions were sharp, methodical. Galina answered them all while silently praying she was steering her son toward mercy rather than ruin. As she spoke, Chernov took notes with slow, deliberate strokes. Not once did his expression change, not even when she described the detailed records Victor had compiled. Names of officers, unexplained cargo transfers, unauthorized movements at the port. When she finished, a long silence filled the room. Chernov finally set his pen down and folded his hands. He thanked her for her loyalty to the state, saying the KGB valued citizens who acted with vigilance. His tone made the compliment feel like a verdict. She wanted to ask what would happen next, but fear held her tongue still. She imagined Victor being questioned gently, warned sternly, perhaps even protected from the corrupt officers he had unknowingly uncovered. She imagined the system she had trusted since childhood showing gratitude to a loyal Soviet mother. Instead, Chernov closed the file with a finality that sent a tremor through her chest and dismissed her with a polite nod. The escort who walked her out did not speak. When she stepped back into the icy Leningrad air, Galina felt an unexpected hollow forming beneath her ribs. For the first time, she wondered if she had misunderstood everything. Loyalty, justice, the state, the meaning of protection. She wrapped her coat tight and hurried home, praying she had not just handed her son to something far darker than danger itself. But the KGB worked quickly, and that night, as she lay awake in the silence of their small apartment, Galina felt it, before she heard it, the inevitable knocking at the door. The knock came just after midnight, when the city was wrapped in a silence so deep It seemed to press against the walls. Galina had been sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, unable to close her eyes after leaving the KGB office. She felt the sound before she understood it, a low, firm rap that carried the unmistakable tone of authority. Her breath caught. She rose slowly, moving through the dark apartment, as if drifting toward a fate already set in motion. Victor stumbled out of his room, half asleep, blinking at the shadows in the hallway. Another knock followed, louder this time, final and demanding. When Victor opened the door, 3 men stepped inside without waiting for permission. They wore long, dark coats that glistened with melting snow, and their expressions were carved into the stone of duty. The tallest one introduced himself briskly as Officer Chernov. Galina felt her knees weaken when she recognized his voice. Victor looked from the officers to his mother, confusion shifting into fear. Chernov asked him to gather his identification and follow them for questioning. His tone was polite, but empty of humanity. Victor asked what this was about. One of the other officers simply said matters of state security. Victor turned to Galina, seeking reassurance, but she could not lift her eyes. Her silence struck him harder than the knock at the door. Realization spread across his face slowly, then all at once. "They know about the notebook," he whispered. His voice carried shock, betrayal, and a kind of dawning horror that cut straight through her. Chernov signaled for his men to proceed. They stepped toward Victor with the efficiency of men who did this often. He was not violent, but they held his arms, firmly guiding him toward the threshold. It happened so fast, yet in Galina's mind, every second stretched into eternity. She tried to speak his name, but her voice collapsed in her throat. Victor looked back at her one last time, and in that look she saw every unanswered question. Did you tell them? Why? How could you? She reached for him, but her hands froze halfway, unable to bridge the distance she had created. The officers led him down the dim stairwell, their footfalls echoing through the building like pounding drums. The moment the door closed behind them, the apartment felt suddenly colder, as if all warmth had been pulled out with him. Galina stood in the hallway, listening to the fading steps, until she could hear nothing but her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She told herself again the same desperate lie, that this was necessary, that the state would handle him gently, because she had brought them the information first. She clung to that belief, as if it were a life raft in a rising sea. She waited at the window, hoping to catch one last glimpse of him, but the officers moved quickly, and the street below was swallowed by darkness. When the final sound of their car vanished into the night, she sank to the floor, gripping her hands so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind replayed Victor's eyes on her eyes, filled with betrayal she had never meant to cause. It was only then, in the crushing silence, that she understood something far too late. The state did not forgive, and it did not protect. It consumed, and she had delivered her only son into its hands. Victor's world shrank the moment the black Volga pulled away from the curb and the city lights blurred into streaks of white and gray. He sat between 2 officers who did not speak a single word during the drive. Their silence was intentional, a tactic meant to let fear do the early work. By the time they reached the KGB detention facility, Victor's pulse had settled into a quiet, relentless panic. They escorted him inside through a maze of sterile hallways that smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant. Every door they passed seemed to seal off the idea of returning home. At the end of a long corridor, an iron door opened into a small, windowless room lit by a single overhead lamp that cast stark shadows across the walls. A metal table stood in the center. Chernov waited on the other side with a folder in front of him, already open, as if Victor's guilt had been fully documented before he even sat down. He gestured to the chair. Victor hesitated but obeyed. Chernov studied him with an expression that hovered between curiosity and certainty. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence press against the young man like an invisible weight. Then he asked the first question. "Do you know why you are here?" Victor tried to keep his voice steady. "No, sir, I do not." Chernov tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "But you do know what you have written. The notebook." The room seemed to tilt. Victor swallowed hard, his palms beginning to sweat. "I wrote observations from the port. Nothing illegal, nothing foreign, nothing dangerous. Just what I saw." Chernov leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with surgical precision. "You documented restricted movements, unauthorized cargo transfers, and the names of officers with high state clearance. You collected it, you organized it, and you hid it. Why?" Victor struggled to breathe evenly. He tried to explain that he was only curious, that he had seen things that did not make sense, that corruption was damaging the country, and he wanted to understand it. He insisted he had no intention of contacting anyone outside the Soviet Union. But the more he spoke, the more Chernov's gaze hardened. Curiosity is a dangerous word, Victor Mikhail. Curiosity is how foreign intelligence finds its openings. Victor shook his head strongly, but the officers behind him shifted, signaling their disbelief before a verdict was ever spoken. Chernov opened the folder wider. Inside were pages from the notebook, copied and organized. Victor's heart dropped. They had already been through his room by the time he reached the facility. They had taken everything. Then Chernov placed a second sheet on the table. A written report, her handwriting unmistakable. Victor felt the air leave his lungs. His mother's statement lay before him like a blade. She reported him. She provided details even he thought she never noticed. For a moment the room dissolved into a ringing void. Chernov watched him closely, observing the collapse of trust, the way botanists observe rare dying flowers. Finally, Victor whispered one question, his voice barely holding together. "What will happen to me?" Chernov's answer was calm, almost gentle. "That depends on your cooperation." It was a promise that carried no real mercy. From that point, the interrogation stretched into hours. Questions repeated, answers dissected, every hesitation noted. Victor realized quickly that this was not an investigation, but an extraction. They wanted names, connections, motives. They wanted a narrative that justified the conclusion they already believed. By dawn, he felt hollowed out, his energy drained by the weight of their accusations. When the officers finally led him to a holding cell, he walked as if in a fever, his thoughts circling only one image, his mother standing in their apartment doorway, not speaking, not warning, not saving. He sank onto the narrow cot, staring at the gray ceiling, until his vision blurred. Somewhere above him, the machinery of the state was already turning, deciding his future. And on the other side of the city, Galina sat alone by the window, unaware that the story she had imagined for her son was no longer in her hands. Morning crept into the apartment like an unwelcome visitor, pale and soundless, illuminating a home that felt suddenly foreign to Galina. She hadn't slept. She had spent the long hours after Victor's arrest pacing from window to window, hoping to see him return, even though she knew hope had no place in a story like hers. The apartment seemed to echo with his absence, his cup on the shelf, his coat hanging by the door, his chair slightly pulled back from the table, as if he had just stood up and might walk in again at any moment. She wrapped her hands around a cup of tea that had long grown cold. Her fingers trembled so badly the porcelain clicked against the table. She told herself she had done what a loyal citizen must do, but the words no longer felt like protection. They felt like lies whispered to numb the truth. When the stairwell outside creaked, she jumped, thinking for one impossible moment that he had been released. But it was only a neighbor carrying groceries and glancing up at her door with quiet suspicion. News traveled fast in buildings like theirs, and silence traveled even faster. Galina retreated deeper into the apartment, closing the curtains as if that could shut out the weight of what she had done. Her mind replayed the moment at the door, the officers stepping in, Victor's eyes widening, his voice cracking when he realized. The memory struck her like a blow each time. She kept whispering the same sentence. You will be safe. Now they will question you, warn you, send you home. But even as she repeated it, she knew she had no control over what the KGB chose to do. She had trusted the state her entire life because trust was the only safe option. Now she felt the edges of that trust fraying, revealing something colder beneath. By midday, she forced herself to leave the apartment and walk to the tram station, hoping movement would quiet her thoughts. The winter wind cut into her cheeks as she watched people hurry past, bundled in thick coats, their faces locked in expressions of practiced indifference. No one noticed her. No one saw the guilt that clung to her like frost. She found herself wandering near the KGB building again, but she could not bring herself to step inside. She knew they would not give answers. They rarely did. Instead, she circled the block several times like a ghost orbiting her own mistake. When she finally returned home, she discovered a slip of paper pushed under the door, a summons for a follow-up interview. It was phrased politely, but its message was unmistakable. She was not done. They wanted more from her, more details, more context, more reasons to justify what they had already begun with Victor. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the paper until it crumpled in her fist. The desire to tear it apart surged through her, but she could not. The state did not tolerate defiance, even small defiance. As evening settled over Leningrad, she stood by the window again, watching the street lamps flicker to life. She imagined Victor in a cold room somewhere answering questions she had placed in front of him like traps. She imagined his look of betrayal and wondered if he would ever forgive her. A single thought began to take hold, one she had pushed away for hours, but could no longer silence. She had not protected her son by turning him in. She had delivered him. And now the state would decide what to do with him, while she waited powerless, trapped in the very loyalty she had believed would save them both. The KGB detention facility breathed with a rhythm all its own, a slow mechanical pulse that seemed to thicken the air. Victor felt it the moment the guards escorted him from his holding cell into the deeper corridors where the real investigations happened. The walls were thick concrete, the lights faint and flickering, and each closed door seemed to hold a story of someone who had entered, but never truly left. His footsteps echoed in a hollow cadence that reminded him he was no longer living in the world he once knew. He was moving inside the veins of the Soviet machine. They brought him into a room larger than the interrogation chamber from the night before. It held a long metal table lined with folders stacked in rigid towers. A different officer waited there this time, an older man with pale eyes that gave nothing away. He introduced himself as Komarov, but his tone offered no humanity. He gestured for Victor to sit. The chair was cold enough to sting through his clothes. Komarov opened a folder with slow, deliberate care, and for a moment Victor thought he heard the faint sound of a clock, even though there was no clock in sight. It was as if the building itself was keeping time. Komarov began with a question that felt almost casual, asking Victor to describe his work routine at the port. Victor tried to answer clearly, but every sentence seemed to be met with suspicion. Komarov pressed him harder, asking why he noticed certain cargo transfers, why he wrote down specific names, why he kept records hidden. Victor explained again that he had seen corruption and secrecy, and he wanted to understand what it meant. Komarov leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Understanding is not your duty," he said in a voice as soft as cold water. "Obedience is your duty." The questioning grew sharper. They asked about foreigners, asking whether he had spoken to sailors from outside the Soviet Union, whether any of them had given him gifts or asked him for favors. Victor denied everything, but denial was not the answer they were looking for. Every time he insisted on his innocence, Komarov wrote something in his notes, and Victor began to realize that his answers mattered far less than the story they intended to write. After hours of questioning, the older officer changed direction. He brought up Galina. He spoke of loyalty. He asked Victor whether he understood the honor of a mother who served the state with such devotion. The words struck like a blade. Victor felt something crumble inside him, and the weight of his mother's choice pressed against his chest until he struggled to breathe. Komarov watched the reaction with clinical precision. Later, they moved him again, guiding him down another hall lined with steel doors. The guards did not touch him roughly, but they did not need to. Their presence alone communicated everything. The next room he entered was even colder. A table, a chair, a single lamp. Komarov stood near the door, observing silently, while another officer placed blank paper in front of Victor and told him to write a full account of everything he knew. Not what he believed harmless, not what he thought necessary. Everything. Victor hesitated only a moment. Then he wrote. He wrote because refusal meant punishment, and obedience was the only thin thread that might keep him alive long enough to see daylight again. As he wrote, he felt the walls tighten around him like jaws closing. Every sentence was a confession, even if the truth behind it was innocent. Every detail was a weapon that could be turned either for him or against him. When he finished, the officer took the papers without expression and left the room. Komarov remained for a moment studying Victor with a gaze that seemed almost curious. "You do not understand the scale of what you uncovered," he said quietly. "Some truths are more dangerous than lies." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Victor alone in the dim light. In that moment, Victor realized something chilling. He was no longer being questioned for the notebook. He was being questioned because the state itself feared what he had stumbled into by accident. And whatever he had unknowingly touched was far larger than corruption at a port. It was a thread woven deep into the fabric of the nation. A thread someone powerful did not want pulled. Galina stepped out of her hotel room into a quiet corridor, washed in the faint glow of early morning. Thin threads of light creeping through the tall windows like silent warnings. And she felt the weight of another sleepless night heavy behind her eyes as she began walking, her senses sharpened to a razor point by the coded message, the attempted break-in, and the sudden reappearance of the American with the scar. She tightened her coat and moved forward with careful precision, knowing she needed to confirm the drop point before making her next contact because the margin for error had now disappeared. Halfway down the corridor she noticed him, a man leaning too casually against the wall near the elevator, early 40s with dark hair and a suit pressed with an almost unnatural neatness, a newspaper held in his hands but never read. He looked up the moment she entered his view, and although she did not change her pace, her instincts recognized surveillance the way a soldier recognizes the sound of approaching artillery. She walked past him without acknowledgement, pressed the elevator button, and stepped inside when the doors opened. He stepped inside as well, placing himself across from her with the quiet authority of someone who understood the mechanics of intimidation. They remained silent as the elevator descended, numbers blinking softly overhead, until he finally said in a low, controlled voice that the name she used to check in was not her real one. Her pulse tightened, but her expression did not shift as she replied that people change their names for personal or professional reasons. He gave a small nod as if this response matched precisely what he expected. Then he leaned slightly forward and murmured that she should leave the hotel after breakfast because someone had arrived late in the night, someone who knew exactly who she was, someone she would not want to meet. When the elevator doors opened, he stayed in place until she stepped out, and by the time she turned back, he had already disappeared into the moving crowd. Crossing the lobby with controlled calm, she felt her thoughts gathering like a rising storm. His warning was precise, too precise, yet she knew better than to accept advice blindly, for men like him rarely acted without purpose, and his intentions might be protection, manipulation, or a test. Outside, she sat on a bench by the fountain, unfolding a map she did not read as she repeated his words again and again in her mind, realizing the message could only mean one thing. The KGB had found her trail. They were not close enough to strike, but close enough to shadow her movements and close enough to corner her if she hesitated. Her safe window was shrinking. The next contact location was known only to 3 people from her past, and she had hoped it would stay buried. But now she doubted everything. Still, she made her decision. She would go there, taking the long routes, the narrow alleys, and the quiet sections of the city where ghosts moved more freely than people. Rising from the bench, she walked toward the market district, blending into the growing crowd while her eyes scanned reflections, footsteps, faces, and every shift of motion around her. She was being hunted again, but she was not finished yet. Galina moved through the market with the calm rhythm of someone pretending to belong, while every sense remained sharpened like a blade. The cold air thick with smoke from early food stalls, and the murmur of soft conversations blending with the clatter of crates being moved as merchants prepared for the day. She scanned faces and reflections in metal surfaces and puddles as she walked, searching for the man she was supposed to meet, a quiet broker of information who never appeared twice in the same place, and who never waited more than 10 minutes for anyone. The rendezvous spot was a narrow passage behind a row of fruit sellers, a place chosen because it was crowded enough to hide a conversation, but still isolated enough for an extraction if one turned dangerous. When she reached it, her pulse tightened. The spot was empty. A crate had been overturned, its contents spilled across the ground, and a single glove lay in the dirt as if dropped in a hurry. She stepped closer, her boots crushing soft vegetables underfoot, and she felt the subtle pressure in her chest that told her something had gone wrong. Her contact was punctual to the minute. This kind of chaos was not part of his habits. She knelt and examined the dirt. 2 sets of footprints were visible, one belonging to someone who was dragged backward, the heel marks deep and uneven. She inhaled slowly, forcing her mind to stay cold. The KGB must have intercepted him before dawn, which meant they were closer than she predicted. She rose and turned toward the main street, blending back into the crowd while her thoughts raced. Her contact never traveled without a fail-safe. If captured, he always left a signal hidden somewhere in the immediate area. Something small, something ordinary. She began searching the stalls, pretending to browse apples and scarves while her eyes traced every corner. After several minutes, she noticed it. A strip of red fabric tied around the bottom leg of a table near a bread stall, barely visible. A code between them. Red meant danger. It also meant run. But it meant something else too. It meant the secondary location was now active. She exhaled, relief mixed with dread, because the secondary location was much riskier. A railway underpass near the edge of the industrial quarter, a place where shadows swallowed sound. She left the market, walking calmly until she turned a corner. Then her strides lengthened, her breath steady but fast. Every step felt heavier, as if the city had begun to close around her. She checked behind her once, twice, then stopped checking altogether because she sensed them now. The silent presence of watchers who did not need to be seen to be real. She hurried through side streets, weaving through alleys and crossing the river on foot, the cold air stinging against her cheeks as she moved. She reached the industrial quarter 30 minutes later, the smell of metal and coal drifting through the wind. The underpass lay ahead, dark and dripping with condensation, and she paused for a moment, her heart beating with the knowledge that stepping inside would bring her closer to answers or straight into a trap. She squared her shoulders, tightened her coat, and stepped into the tunnel as the echo of her footsteps vanished into the heavy silence. Galina stepped into the underpass and felt the temperature drop instantly, the cold settling on her skin like a warning as the muted hum of the city faded behind her and the echo of her footsteps stretched along the tunnel's damp concrete walls. The faint flicker of a dying bulb cast uneven light patterns that danced across the ground, revealing puddles that shimmered like thin sheets of mercury. She walked deeper, every step measured, her breathing controlled, her hand near the pocket where she kept a narrow blade she could draw in a single fluid motion. Then she saw him. A man standing near the midpoint of the tunnel, his figure half consumed by darkness. He was not her contact. She recognized that immediately. The posture was wrong. The stance was too rigid, too controlled. Slowly, he stepped into the weak glow of the flickering bulb, revealing a pale face with a thin scar running across his jaw. She had seen that face once before, reflected in the glass doors of her hotel when she first arrived. A watcher, a hunter, someone who trailed her without blinking. She did not move, her eyes locked on his, measuring the space between them. He spoke first, his voice quiet yet firm, saying she had been walking in circles for days, evading shadows, but shadows learned to adapt. She replied calmly that he was following the wrong person, but he shook his head with unsettling certainty, saying he knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had done. The words hung in the air like ice. She asked where her original contact was. He paused, then answered that her contact had been taken at dawn and was now in a place where silence was permanent. She felt the blow but did not let it show. She asked why he was here alone, a question meant to disrupt his confidence, and he responded that he was not. At that moment she heard soft footsteps behind her. Her muscles tightened, but she did not look back. She simply listened. Two people. Light, careful steps. Well-trained. She knew she had walked into a controlled funnel. The man in front of her began stepping closer. He told her there were orders to bring her in alive, though he personally did not care in what state she arrived. She glanced toward the opposite end of the tunnel. It was too far, too narrow, and too exposed. But she also noticed something. A small ventilation grate on the right wall, slightly lifted, a sign of recent disturbance, a signal. Someone had been there before her, perhaps her contact, perhaps someone unexpected. She made her decision in a heartbeat. She moved not backward but sideways, slipping toward the grate just as the scarred man lunged. She drove her shoulder into a pipe, knocking it loose, and the sudden burst of steam filled the tunnel, creating a thick cloud that swallowed the space in seconds. Shouts erupted behind her as she pulled herself through the narrow gap behind the grate, scraping her arms on the metal edges. The world shrank into darkness for a moment, then widened into a maintenance shaft she had not known existed. She crawled forward, the sounds of pursuit muffled behind her as steam continued to roar through the pipe. The shaft led upward toward faint daylight, a possible escape or another trap. But she kept moving, her breath fast but controlled, knowing she had only seconds before the hunters regained their view. She pushed forward, emerging into a hidden service corridor above the railway tracks, her body shaking from adrenaline and cold. She rose to her feet, wiped the blood from her fingers, and listened carefully. No footsteps yet. She was alive. But what awaited ahead would test her in ways she had not yet imagined. Galina hurried along the narrow service corridor that opened above the old railway lines, the metallic scent of rust filling the air and her footsteps tapping softly on the gridded floor as she made her way toward a far exit she hoped would lead her out of the tightening KGB dragnet. The city around her seemed to pulse with unseen danger, as if every wall and rooftop watched her movements. She reached the edge of the platform and looked out across a vast stretch of abandoned industrial yards filled with broken machinery and scattered freight cars, a place where secrets often vanished without sound. For a moment she allowed herself a breath of cold air. Then she spotted two small figures emerging through the fog near the tracks, their pace steady and coordinated in a way that told her they were trained operatives. She knew they were searching for her. She knew she was running out of places to disappear. She descended the ladder from the service walkway and moved across the empty lot, keeping to the shadows of overturned rail carts and twisted pipes. Every instinct she had developed over decades pushed her forward and kept her alive as she navigated the maze of rusted structures. She reached a derelict control building and slipped inside, finding a cracked window with a fading view of the yard. She waited there in silence, her breath slowed, her hand ready. When the two operatives crossed the tracks below, she studied their movements. One of them carried a small leather case she recognized at once as the field interrogation kit used during quick captures in isolated zones. That meant they had no intention of killing her on sight. They wanted information. They wanted names. They wanted confessions crafted under the weight of fear. She would not allow them that victory. She moved away from the window and searched the building for an exit that would take her toward the riverbank. A narrow stairwell led to a lower floor, littered with dust and broken gauges. She stepped lightly, listening for any hint of footsteps behind her. When she reached the back doorway, she saw something unexpected. A figure standing outside. A man with a familiar posture. The stranger from the hotel corridor. The one who warned her earlier. He stood beneath a broken lamp, his hands visible, his expression calm. She froze, unsure whether he had led her into a trap or saved her by appearing now. He whispered to her to follow quickly because the window was closing and the operatives had been given her full description and a perimeter order. She hesitated, but realized she had no better option. They moved together through a narrow alley of abandoned machinery. He explained while they walked that he was not KGB, but belonged to a small internal counterfaction who believed the old guard was destroying the future of the country. He said he had been watching her for weeks and knew she carried a truth that could bury powerful men. She listened without slowing, but did not fully trust him. Trust was the first luxury a spy loses. The fog thickened as they approached the river where a hidden service boat sometimes docked. When they reached the embankment, the boat was there, small and weathered with a tarped roof. He told her this was her chance to escape the city and reach a safe zone before the KGB locked the borders. She stepped toward the boat, but then heard footsteps racing along the concrete behind them. The two operatives had found the trail. Shots cracked through the cold air as she ducked behind a metal pillar, adrenaline burning through her chest. She returned fire once, enough to scatter their aim. The stranger pushed the boat away from the dock and shouted for her to jump. She sprinted to the edge as bullets sparked off the railings beside her, and she leapt onto the deck, rolling across the boards while the stranger struggled with the motor. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the dark water as the operatives reached the embankment, firing again but losing sight of the boat in the thick fog rolling off the river. Galina leaned against the side of the boat, her breath shaking, her body bruised and cold. The stranger sat at the motor, eyes forward. The river carried them away from the reach of the hunters. He told her he would take her to a safe house across the border, where she could finally decide her own fate. She stared into the fog, remembering the day she turned her son into the KGB, a decision made under pressure, fear, and indoctrination. She had lived with that guilt carved into her soul like a scar. She knew she could never undo what happened, but she also knew she could still choose what became of her story. The boat slipped into the night, leaving the city and the past behind, as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Galina reached the safe house by mid-morning, a quiet cabin hidden inside a forest of birch trees near the border. The stranger gave her a warm drink and told her she was now beyond the immediate reach of the KGB. She sat by the window and watched the river flowing past the distant hills, her reflection blending with the landscape as if she were becoming part of the silence around her. Her life had been an endless corridor of secrets, betrayals, and desperate choices. She remembered the moment she surrendered her son to the KGB, convinced she was serving the state and protecting her country. But she had spent the rest of her life haunted by the truth that she had sacrificed part of her soul that day. Now the world had shifted. The Cold War was aging, and old mechanisms of control were beginning to fracture. Somewhere beyond the borders, her son lived with a new name and a life untouched by the ghosts that clawed at her memories. She hoped he would never know the full weight of what she had done. She hoped he would never meet the shadows she carried. As daylight filtered through the birch leaves, she realized that survival was no longer the goal. The goal was redemption in whatever small form remained. The stranger asked her what she planned to do next. She answered softly that she would not run anymore. She would tell the truth. She would reveal the secrets she once guarded with her life. She would expose the lies she had served. And in doing so, she hoped her son, wherever he was, would understand the cost of loyalty shaped by fear. Galina stepped outside and felt the cold morning breeze sweep across the forest. The sky glowed with soft colors. The air tasted like a beginning. After a lifetime spent in the shadows, she finally walked toward the light, determined to let her story become a warning rather than a weapon. The river continued its slow journey downstream, carrying away the last remnants of her former life. What remained was a woman who had endured the machinery of an empire and found the courage to stand against it at last. This is where her shadow ends. This is where her truth begins. Thank you for watching. If you want more true spy stories from the hidden world of Cold War intelligence, remember to like, subscribe, and share for future investigations.